Arizona Territory, May 1879. The wind pushed hard against the sides of the old barn, rattling loose boards and sending dust spinning through the cracks as Kenzie Carter pressed her back tighter to the cold wall. Her arms wrapped around her knees, and her dress thin and worn through at the elbows did little to keep out the chill. Somewhere outside, a coyote howled, and the mare in the next stall snorted nervously. She had nothing left but the clothes on her back and a silver locket with no picture inside. The barn had once belonged to a family who moved east last winter. Now it was hers in a way. It leaked when it rained, and the hay was near gone, but it was better than sleeping out on the open ground. Kenzie had not eaten since the day before yesterday, when she'd traded a pair of wool socks she found in the old house for a hunk of dry bread in town. The shopkeeper's wife had looked at her like something stuck to the bottom of her shoe. There was no job to be had. No one wanted a young woman with no dowry, no family, and too many calluses on her hands. She pulled her shawl tighter and closed her eyes. All she wanted was a place where she was not a burden or pitied, a place she could be wanted. A loud creak outside made her start. She scrambled up, her heart thudding as the barn doors opened just enough to let the early morning light spill in. A tall man stepped inside, silhouetted by dawn. He wore a wide-brimmed hat and a trail coat dusted with red earth. A rifle was slung across his back, but his hands were empty. He was not the kind of man who looked lost. Kenzie didn't move. The man's eyes found her quick in the shadows. "You live here?" he asked, his voice low but clear. She hesitated. "I sleep here." He stepped closer, careful not to startle her. His boots were scuffed, his jeans worn through at the knees, but he looked solid, real. "Name's Isaiah Colter. I lease the land west of here. Came to check on this barn." Did not expect company. Kenzie's fingers tightened around the edge of her shawl. "I will leave." "I did not say you had to." She stared at him, unsure what to say. His voice was calm, not harsh. He looked at her like he was trying to understand, not judge. "You got people?" he asked. "No," she said. "Not anymore." He nodded slowly, like he already figured that. "You hungry?" Kenzie's stomach answered for her, growling loud into the silence. Her face flushed. Isaiah turned, walked back through the barn doors, and returned a minute later with a small canvas bag. He handed it to her without a word. Inside was a biscuit, jerky, and a green apple. She looked up at him, unsure. He gave a small shrug. "Had extra." Kenzie sat back down on her blanket and ate slowly, careful not to look too grateful, but her hands shook as she held the apple. It had been weeks since she tasted something fresh. Isaiah leaned against the stall gate, watching her with quiet eyes. "You from around here?" "No," she said. "My father brought us out from Kansas. He died last spring, then my mother took ill. I buried her 2 months ago." Her voice cracked. "I have no dowry, no land, no kin." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "You know how to work stock?" Kenzie lifted her chin. "I can handle a horse. I have cleaned stalls since I was 10. I can cook, mend, and shoe a mule if I have to." Isaiah's eyes flicked to the fraying hem of her dress. "I could use help on the ranch. It is just me since my brother moved north. It is not charity. I pay fair." She studied him. "Why help me?" He looked straight at her. "Because you are here." "Because it is right." Kenzie stood slowly. Her legs still felt weak, but she managed to meet his gaze. "I will work. I do not want pity. You will not get it from me." That was the beginning. She followed him to his ranch, a modest spread tucked against the red cliffs. The house was simple, just 2 rooms and a porch that creaked underfoot, but it had a roof that did not leak, and a stove that roared with heat. Isaiah showed her the barn, the corral, and the chicken coop. By the end of the day, her dress was streaked with dust and her hands raw from the work, but her heart beat steady. She felt alive again. Isaiah was not a man of many words, but he noticed things. When she favored her right leg, he handed her a stool. When her hair came loose in the wind, he looked away, but not before she saw the way his mouth twitched. Not a smile exactly, something quieter. At night, he gave her the small room at the back of the house and lit the lantern for her. She stood in the doorway, staring at the cot and clean blanket. "You can lock the door if you want," he said. "No one will bother you here." "I believe you," she said softly. Each day after that slid into the next. She helped with the stock, cooked meals, mended a fence that had been leaning too long. Isaiah worked beside her, quiet and steady. Sometimes he told her things about his mother's pies, or how he once broke a colt in under an hour. She listened. She told him little by little about her life before, and he never once looked away. One night, 2 weeks after she came to the ranch, she stepped onto the porch after supper. The stars were spread thick over the sky, and the wind had the scent of wild sage. Isaiah sat on the steps, sharpening a small knife. She sat beside him. "You always work this late, helps me think." She glanced at him. "What do you think about?" He looked at her. "You." The word hit her like a stone dropped in still water. Isaiah set the knife down. "You have no dowry, no land, but you work harder than anyone I have known. You make this place feel less empty." Kenzie stared at her hands. "People want things they can build on." "I have nothing to offer. You have yourself. That is enough for me." She looked up at him, eyes wide. "Why?" He reached out, not fast, just sure. His calloused hand brushed a strand of hair from her cheek. "Because when I look at you, I do not see what you lost. I see what you are." Her throat tightened. She had not cried in front of anyone since her father died. But now her eyes burned. Isaiah leaned closer, his forehead touching hers. "I want to ask you something." Kenzie nodded. "Will you marry me?" She blinked, stunned. "You would take a wife with no dowry." "I want a partner, not a price tag." Her breath caught. "Yes," she whispered. Isaiah pulled her into his arms, and for the first time in a long time, Kenzie felt warm all the way through. She had slept in an abandoned barn, too poor for anything else. Now, she would sleep in a home with a man who saw her, chose her, and loved her. Kenzie stood barefoot on the wooden floor of the bedroom, the first birdsong of morning threading through the open window. The hem of her nightdress brushed her ankles as she braided her hair with slow, practiced fingers. The cotton fabric still carried the smell of lye soap and the faintest trace of desert wind. Her eyes drifted toward the hills beyond the ranch, gold light touching the cliffs like a blessing. Isaiah had left before sunrise to check the southern fence line. He told her the cattle had been favoring the shaded arroyo the past few days, and he didn't trust the wire to hold if a storm rolled down. She had offered to go with him, but he'd only touched her arm gently and said, "You've got enough on your hands here." She did. The kitchen stove had cooled overnight, so she built it back from embers, coaxing flame from the coals. The hens needed feeding. There were shirts to mend, and a leak in the wash basin she was determined to patch today. She moved through it all steady, her body quick and capable, but her thoughts kept returning to the quiet moment they'd shared on the porch. To the way his hand had rested at the small of her back as they'd stepped inside. It had not felt like a promise, it had felt like something already kept. By midday, heat shimmered off the yard. Kenzie shaded her eyes and spotted Isaiah leading a roan gelding toward the barn. His shirt clung to his back, sweat darkening the fabric, and his hat sat low over his eyes. She met him halfway, a damp cloth in one hand. "Fence still holding?" she asked, reaching up to wipe the dust from his cheek. He nodded, closing his eyes for a brief moment beneath her touch. "One post gave some trouble, but I set it right." "You didn't eat," she said, glancing toward the house. "Didn't feel like stopping." Kenzie folded the cloth and tucked it into her apron. "Sit, I'll bring something out." He didn't argue. Isaiah rested against the porch rail while she brought out a plate with cooled cornbread, beans, and a jar of dill pickles she'd found sealed tight in the root cellar. He ate without hurry, eyes on the horizon. "I'm thinking of building on," he said between bites. "A lean-to off the back for a proper root house, and maybe a stone path down to the well so your slippers don't wear through as fast." "You watch my slippers?" she asked, one brow lifting. "I watch everything that matters." Kenzie sat beside him, gathering her knees in close. "You always talk like that." "Like what?" "Like you've thought every word through a dozen times before saying it." He reached for her hand, calloused fingers brushing her knuckles. "I do." She turned her palm into his. "What else have you thought through?" Isaiah ran his thumb along the edge of her hand, slow and sure. "Where to plant cottonwood for shade near the house, how long it'll take to build a second room, whether you'd want a garden or fruit trees. If we could keep bees." Kenzie leaned her head against his shoulder. "You plan far ahead." "I want you to have more than dust and dry wind," he said. "I want you to have sweetness." The words settled between them like something sacred. Later that week, they rode into Bisbee, the nearest town with a circuit preacher. Isaiah wore his best vest, and Kenzie had stitched a ribbon to the collar of her only blue dress. Her palms were damp as they tied up the horses, but Isaiah offered his arm without hesitation. The preacher's wife had eyes like flint, but she softened when Kenzie returned her gaze steady and calm. "There's no music," the preacher warned as he opened the chapel doors. "No flowers either unless you brought your own." Kenzie looked up at Isaiah. "He brought me," she said. They stood before the altar, hands clasped. The vows were spoken simply, without flourish. Isaiah's voice did not waver. Kenzie's lips trembled only once when she said his name. Afterward, they rode home as husband and wife. No celebration, but the wind was gentle and the sun warm. As they passed the cottonwoods, Isaiah reached over and took her hand again, weaving their fingers together atop the saddle horn. That night, she lit a lantern in the bedroom and set it on the windowsill. Isaiah stood behind her, hands at her waist, his chin resting against her temple. "I never thought I'd live like this," she whispered. "Like what?" "Like I was wanted." He turned her gently until they faced each other. "You are, and not because you need shelter or because I had room to spare. You're wanted because you're strong and kind, and you came through every storm with your heart still open." Kenzie rested her hands on his chest, feeling the slow, steady beat beneath. "I want to make this place more than a refuge. I want it to be a home." "It already is," he said. "Because you're in it." That night the wind carried no chill and the stars blinked soft above the roof. Inside, two hearts beat in rhythm, no longer alone, and in the hush between words and sleep, Kenzie finally believed what she'd never dared to before: she belonged. By late June, the mesquite trees around the ranch had gone thick with feathery green, and the cicadas sang so loudly at dusk, it felt like the air itself vibrated. Kenzie stood barefoot in the shallow ditch behind the house, skirts gathered above her knees, water from the spring-fed pipe rushing over her ankles as she cleared away the stones that had gathered during the last rain. Her back ached from bending, but she didn't straighten until every clump of weeds was pulled and the water ran clean again. Isaiah's voice reached her from the slope above. "You think that ditch is gonna thank you for all that fuss?" She looked up, shielding her eyes. "It's not for the ditch. The garden needs water." He came down the path, his sleeves rolled high, a coil of wire in one hand and his knife in the other. "You always this stubborn when something needs doing." Kenzie rinsed her hands and stepped out of the ditch. "If it's worth doing, yes." Isaiah nodded once as if that settled something between them. "I saw a deer this morning just past the bluff. Young buck, barely old enough to hold his antlers up straight. Did he run? No, he said, just looked at me like I didn't belong. Then walked off like I wasn't worth the trouble. Kenzie picked up her pail and started up the hill beside him. Maybe he figured you were part of the land, or maybe I'm getting slow. She glanced sideways. You're not slow. Isaiah chuckled low in his throat, then stopped walking as they reached the porch. I've been thinking something through. Kenzie set the pail down beside the door and waited. He studied the horizon a long moment. I want to brand the cattle with a new mark. Something different from my father's, something that's ours. Kenzie leaned against the post, quiet. What would it be? I thought a crescent. For the moon, you said once it made the night feel less empty. She let that settle deep in her chest before answering. That would be right. Inside, the kitchen held the scent of juniper wood and dry sage from the bundle she'd hung over the stove. She ladled stew into the bowl he offered, brushing his wrist as she passed it. That night after supper, Isaiah took down a small wooden box from the shelf above the hearth. He opened it on the table without a word. Inside were folded papers, a carved bone-handled pen, and a narrow strip of blue ribbon. Kenzie touched the edge of the ribbon. That's from your mother's shawl. Isaiah nodded. She wrapped it around my wrist before I left for Texas the first time, said it would remind me not to forget where I came from. Kenzie folded her hands in her lap. Did you? Almost, he said, but then I came back. He slid a folded document toward her. This is the deed, I want your name on it. She hesitated. You already brought me here without asking for anything back. I'm not giving you land, he said. I'm putting your name beside mine because this is your home too. She touched the edge of the paper. What if someone from town says otherwise? I don't answer to them, he said, and neither do you. Kenzie pressed a hand to her chest, breath catching. Write it then. Let it be ours. He dipped the pen, the ink slow to draw, and wrote her name beside his in careful strokes. No flourish, no ceremony, just truth. Later, as the oil lamp flickered low and the wind shifted through the open window, Isaiah sat on the edge of the bed, his hand still stained faintly with ink. What do you miss most? He asked, voice low. Kenzie pulled the quilt higher over her knees. Music. My father used to play fiddle in the evenings, nothing fancy, just enough to make the dark feel like something soft. Isaiah leaned back, arms crossed behind his head. There's a man in Tombstone sells instruments. I might see what he's got next trip. You don't have to, I know, he said. But I want to. Kenzie turned toward him, the lamp brushing gold across his cheek. What about you? What do you miss? He was quiet a long time. My brother's laugh. It had a way of making a hard day feel like nothing. Kenzie reached for his hand beneath the quilt. I can't bring that back. Isaiah laced his fingers with hers. No, but you gave me something I didn't know I needed. What's that? Peace. She rested her head on his shoulder, the hush between them full of more than silence. Full of something slow and real, like water soaking deep into dry earth. Outside, the wind moved through the cottonwoods. Inside, the fire burned low, and neither of them spoke again for a long while. They didn't need to. The land was still rough, the work never done, but the ache of loneliness had gone quiet. And for the first time in her life, Kenzie didn't have to wonder where she belonged. She already knew. The sky had turned overcast by early July, the kind of high, gray ceiling that promised rain but never quite delivered. A dry wind rolled across the hills, carrying the scent of creosote and dust. Kenzie stood at the edge of the pasture, her hand resting on the split-rail fence Isaiah had reinforced just last week. She watched a pair of calves tussle near the water trough, their legs too long to move with any grace. Behind her, the sound of boots in the gravel made her glance back. Isaiah approached with his hat in one hand and something wrapped in linen in the other. "You remember that old cottonwood by the north path?" he asked, stopping a few paces from her. She nodded. "There was a hive in the hollow. I brought back a bit of comb." He unwrapped the linen and revealed a chunk of honey-glazed wax, golden and thick. Kenzie reached for it, her fingers brushing the edge. "You didn't get stung?" "Once," he said, flexing his hand. "Worth it." She broke a piece off and took a bite, the sweetness cutting through the dust in her throat. Isaiah leaned on the fence, watching the calves. "I've been thinking about how we spend our days." Kenzie swallowed and looked at him. "What about them?" "They're full, but not always with the things we want to remember," her brow knit. "You regret any of it?" "No," he said, shaking his head. "But I want to mark more than just work. I want to set aside pieces of time that are ours." She considered him, the way his shoulders settled when he spoke plainly. "How would we start?" "There's a canyon I came through once south of here. Narrow and quiet, wildflowers even in summer. Thought we could ride out there." "Just for the day?" Kenzie hesitated. "That's nearly 20 miles, isn't it?" 18, he said. "If we leave before sunup, we'll be back by dark." She traced the grain of the fence rail with her thumb. "We'd have to pack light. Water, biscuits, maybe dried peaches." Isaiah smiled, slow and sure. "I already set the canteens by the door." They left before dawn 2 days later. The light was still thin when they rode out past the last fence post. Gravel gave way to hard, packed trail, and the land opened wide, unrolling in long stretches of scrub and sandstone. Kenzie rode ahead for a while, her braid tucked into a handkerchief beneath her hat, her eyes scanning the horizon with quiet determination. Isaiah followed, letting the rhythm of the ride settle into his bones. By midday they reached the canyon. It cut narrow between two ridges, the walls streaked with old mineral lines and draped with vines. A small creek ran through the center, shallow and clear. Kenzie dismounted first, her boots slipping slightly on the rounded stones. She walked to the water's edge and crouched, cupping her hands to drink. Isaiah let the horses graze and sat on a flat rock a few yards away, watching her with a kind of still wonder. "You ever think we'd end up here?" he asked after a while. Kenzie looked up from where she was trailing her fingers through the water. "No, I didn't think that far ahead." "What did you think about?" "Getting through the day, keeping my hands busy, trying not to disappear." Isaiah stood and crossed to her. "You never disappeared, Kenzie. You endured." She leaned into him as he sat beside her on the bank, the warmth of his arm steady against hers. "You gave me more than I knew to ask for." He looked down at her hand resting between them. "I wanted to ask something, not because I need to hear it, but because I want to know." She turned toward him, eyes steady. "Do you feel safe with me?" She held his gaze. "Yes. But more than that, I feel chosen." Isaiah reached into his coat pocket and drew out a simple band made of hammered copper. "Found this in a trading post months back. Meant to give it the day we wed, but I didn't want to make a show." Kenzie took it, her fingers trembling just slightly. "It's warm. Been in my pocket all morning." She slid it onto her finger, the fit snug but right. "It's perfect." They sat together in the hush of the canyon, the creek whispering over stone, the air thick with the scent of blooming wild tobacco. No words passed between them for a long stretch. When the sun dipped low, they mounted up and turned back toward the ranch. The trail home felt shorter somehow. They didn't speak much, but Isaiah reached for her hand when the path widened enough, their fingers brushing just enough to remind her they were not alone anymore. That night, as the wind cooled the edges of the house and the lantern burned low, Isaiah ran his fingers over the copper ring as she slept beside him. He didn't need to speak the thought that settled deep in his chest. They had built something out of nothing, and it would hold. By early September, the monsoons had passed, and the air held a faint trace of coolness in the early hours before sunup. Isaiah rose first most mornings, but today Kenzie was already at the stove, her braided hair tucked beneath a scarf, sleeves rolled. The scent of cornmeal frying in lard filled the small house, and a pot of chicory brew steamed beside the kettle. Isaiah leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. "That's a fine smell to wake to." "I wanted to try roasting the cornmeal like my mother used to," she said, not turning. "It makes the cakes hold together better." He stepped closer, brushing his hand along the edge of the table where she'd laid out a folded cloth for wrapping. "You planning to take these somewhere?" she nodded, flipping a cake. "Mrs. Bellamy's boy cut his leg on a wire gate. I thought I'd bring them something warm. He's been laid up nearly a week." Isaiah watched her face as she plated the cakes. "You've come to know this place like you were born here." "I didn't think I would," she admitted. "But it doesn't feel like I'm borrowing space anymore." He helped her bundle the food while she filled a small jar with honey from their hive. In silence, they packed the satchel, shoulders brushing. When the bundle was tied, she stood facing him. "I've been thinking," she said quietly. He waited. "I'd like to start teaching the children near here, just once or twice a week. Reading, mostly. A few can't even scratch their names." Isaiah's brow lifted. "Where would you hold lessons? If the Bellamys let me use their back porch, I'd start there." "It's shaded and the bench is wide enough for 3. He nodded slowly. "You'd make a fine teacher." Kenzie looked at her hands. "I don't have the schooling some expect. You have patience, and you care if they learn. That's more than most." She exhaled, something loosening in her shoulders. "I was afraid you might think it foolish." "I think it's right," he said. "And if you need extra hands, I can spare the time." Kenzie smiled, soft and sure. "You'd raid with them." "I'd try," he said. "But I warn you, I never took to poetry." "No one starts with poetry," she said. "You begin with names." Later that afternoon, after delivering the cakes and checking in on the boys' stitches, Kenzie walked the dry wash back toward home. A kestrel circled overhead, sharp against the sky. When she rounded the bend, she saw Isaiah by the corral, speaking with a man on horseback. She watched from a distance. The rider wore a worn black coat and held himself stiffly, like a man used to giving orders. Isaiah stood easy, hat in hand, but his jaw was tight. When the rider tipped his hat and turned back toward the trail, Kenzie walked down the slope to meet Isaiah. "Who was that?" "Land agent from down near Tucson. Said he's buying up parcels for some outfit out of St. Louis. Wants to bring in rail lines and shipping yards." "Here?" Isaiah nodded. "He asked if I'd sell." Kenzie's stomach turned, and I told him no. She stepped closer. "Was he pressing?" "Not more than words can press, but he'll be back." Kenzie looked toward the hills, dry and golden. "Do we have the deed in order?" "Yes," he said. "Your name's still written beside mine." That night, after supper, Isaiah pulled a wrapped bundle from beneath the bedframe and laid it on the table. Inside was a folded length of muslin and a carefully stitched quilt square, soft blue with cornering vines. "I've been working on it in the barn," he said. "Only when you weren't looking." She ran her fingers over the stitching. "It's our brand," he nodded. "I thought maybe when it's done we could hang it near the gate. Show what we've built." Kenzie leaned in and kissed his cheek, then rested her head against his shoulder. "We'll finish it together." The days shortened. The first frost dusted the fence posts in October, and the cottonwoods dropped their leaves in slow spirals. Kenzie began teaching on the Bellamy porch, the children arriving shy and barefoot, clutching slates and chalk. She taught them letters and names, and how to listen without fear. Isaiah built her a low bench from split cedar and fitted it with a cushion of horsehair wrapped in ticking. At night, they read aloud from the old Bible his mother had left behind, not out of duty but rhythm. Words shared between them like water drawn from a well. On the last warm evening before the cold settled in, Isaiah took her hand as they walked the edge of the pasture. The cattle grazed quiet and the sky turned lavender above the cliffs. "You ever regret saying yes?" he asked. She stopped and faced him, her fingers tightening around his. "Not once." He brushed a loose strand of hair from her brow. "Even with the work, the wind, the lean seasons. All of it," she said. "If it ends with you, I'd choose it again." Isaiah leaned in and kissed her, slow and unhurried, like a man who had learned not to rush what mattered. When he pulled back, he rested his forehead against hers. "This land will change. Men like that agent will keep coming, but we won't sell. We'll hold this place." "We will," she said, "because it's ours." And it was. The house with its creaking porch and hand-hewn beams. The pasture fence they mended each spring. The quilt they stitched by firelight, square by square. The children who learned to read their names in her careful hand. The world beyond might press in, but they had carved out something quiet and good, and they stood in it together. Years passed. The trail leading to their gate wore smooth from wagon wheels. The garden behind the house gave tomatoes and beans, then squash and corn. The beehive stayed strong. The cattle multiplied. The Crescent brand became known through the valley, not for wealth but for decency. They grew older with the land, hands rough with labor, hearts full with each other. And in every season, from the long rains to the dry winds, they chose the same thing again and again. To endure together, to love without needing to say so, to build a life that held. They had no need to look back. Everything they'd once lost had led them here. And here they stayed safe, steady and deeply, wholly loved.